That's me. Hi, this is Tasha. I'm JJ's mom.
Hi, my name is Linda, and I'm JJ's grandmother.
Hi, my name is Francis Milton, and I'm Jaidon's granddad.
I'm Justin, and I'm his dad.
Good afternoon. My name is Jaidon Faircloth Scott. As of 2024, there are currently 193 member states a part of the United Nations today. These states undergo international cooperation and establishment of international relations across sovereign borders. Throughout my extensive research, I have used various credible sources, including the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, the Library of Congress, and the National World War II Museum. Today, I'll be informing you as to the purpose of the United Nations. Specifically, I'll be discussing the origin of the United Nations, the structure and organization itself, and the methods and processes of how the United Nations effectively enforces its resolutions today. On November 11th of 1914, Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated, who was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This resulted in Austria-Hungary and Serbia declaring war. Now you may be thinking the problem with this. The problem was secret alliances. Serbia was aligned with Russia, and Austria-Hungary was aligned with France. This resulted in a larger war than what would have been. And shortly after, Germany and Britain followed suit, which led to the First World War, of which around 8.5 million to 10 million casualties were estimated. Post-World War I, the League of Nations was established by the victorious powers in order to establish an international body which would prevent any future world war and monitor any international agreements between major powers. This continued during the late 1910s, the 1920s, and early 1930s. However, with the rise of the Nazi Party and Nazi Germany, this led to an era of expansionism, which resulted in the Second World War on the 1st of September 1939. At the conclusion of the Second World War, the Allies, including the United States, France, Britain, the Soviet Union, and China, alongside other allied nations, established the United Nations. The United Nations was established to build upon the perceived failures of the League of Nations, to establish an international body which should be able to effectively enforce international law and prevent future world wars. Now, the UN Charter was the binding principle of the United Nations. It included the 6 main organizations in the United Nations itself. This included the General Assembly, the Social and Economic Cultural Council, the Trusteeship Council, the International Court of Justice, the UN Security Council, and the UN Secretariat. The General Assembly is responsible for approving the UN's budget, for electing the UN Secretary General with recommendations from the UN Security Council, and developing policies as it is the primary decision-making body of the United Nations. The Economic and Social Council is responsible for developing sustained growth in economics, culture, and society in many developing countries. The International Court of Justice was established to develop international law, and the UN Security Council was established to effectively enforce UN policies and to maintain security across the globe while resolving any disputes that may lead to outward war. The UN Secretariat is responsible for the daily functioning of the United Nations, with its department head being the Secretary General. Now you may be mentioning or maybe thinking how the United Nations effectively enforces its policies. It does so through the peacekeepers and the UN Charter. UN peacekeepers are military personnel, police, and civilian personnel contributed to the United Nations by its member states. They undergo peacekeeping operations across the globe. Their funding primarily comes from contributions in resources and funding from its member states, with the highest of which being the United States itself at over 27%. The The UN Charter, as I mentioned before, is the binding legal document of the United Nations and established international law. Three primary components of the UN Charter are the UN Peace, or the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which requires member states to prevent and punish any act of genocide in their borders. The United Nations Law of the Sea is responsible for maintaining and establishing international law in regards to the ocean. The Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty is responsible for banning the use of nuclear testing for civilian or military purposes. The United Nations is a dynamic organization with many moving parts. The effects and the history of the 20th century continues to affect the United Nations policies today, with the ultimate goal of the United Nations being to pursue a free and prosperous world and a world without war. Thank you for listening, and I hope you learned something about the United Nations today.
Yeah, that